When I was growing up in the late 1970s and first started reading comic books, Marvel would reprint a lot of their earlier titles, their 1960s comics, at the same time that they had new comics coming out. So, for example, the Avengers 1960s issues were reprinted in Marvel Triple Action. These two comics came out the same month, and I bought this particular copy at that time. Now, when Marvel Triple Action was canceled, it was replaced by Marvel Super Action. And again, these two comics came out the very same month, and I bought both issues as they were released. So even though I was only 9 years old or so when these came out in 1979, and I was a fan of the Avengers, I was exposed to both the current team as well as their history through reprints of those 1960s comics. So this, I think, gave me an appreciation of comics that had been published before I was even born. Later on, shortly after, I started getting Stan Lee's books about the history of Marvel. Basically, these would reprint, and these are all copies I had when I was like 10 years old. These would reprint um, old comics. There's a reprint of the very first Fantastic Four story, and then Fantastic Four number 55, and so on, the first Hulk. And so I had an appreciation of these comics, these older comics. So my first exposure to Steve Ditko's work was the very first Spider-Man story. And in this story that this Origins of Marvel Comics, for example, Stan Lee portrayed the comics that Marvel published prior to Fantastic Four number 1 in 1961. He portrayed them as sort of, mediocre and not terribly interesting, because of course they were not as successful as what came later with the superheroes. So he refers to some of these characters, Fin Fang Foom, and so on. We were turning out comics by the carload, but nothing much was happening. Well, so I kind of assumed that maybe those comics weren't as interesting. But later on, I became exposed to reprints of those comics and took an interest in them, probably because I had developed a love of older comics through my exposure to them through the Marvel superhero comics that Marvel was reprinting at the time. In 1983, when I was around 12 years old, I started picking up magazines about comics. And this comics collector magazine came out in 1983, late 83. And, I picked it up because I was interested in comic books, but it also exposed me to the history of comics as well. This article by Lawrence Watt Evans was my very first exposure to EC Comics, for example. And so I took an interest based on what I was reading in these comics. This third issue, which came out in early 1984, was a very pivotal one because it introduced me to, through an article by Will Murray, the Marvel Monster comics that Stan Lee had referred to in Origins of Marvel Comics. Characters like Fin Fang Foom. And this article printed some of the pages and talked about Will Murray's love of these comics as a child when he first was exposed to Marvel Comics. And the fact that these comics were no longer being published, had been totally, basically forgotten, made me take an interest in them. I wanted to read them myself. And so I started to seek them out. There's another article here, another Lawrence Watt Evans article, talking about the history of non-EC horror comics of the 1950s. And again, this was, fascinating stuff. So next time I went to my local comic shop, I decided to check out the cheap bins where I usually bought my comics for examples of 1950s horror comics. And of course I couldn't afford them back then, but I was able to find reprints of them that Marvel had done in the 1970s, similarly to how they had reprinted their superhero comics throughout that decade. And eventually, I got a bunch of them. Now these are all my weird Wonder Tales issues. Not all of them were purchased back at that time. In fact, let's see here. This one I believe I purchased back then, and this one was the first one I ever bought in the 5 for $1 boxes at my local comic shop. And these had new covers, from the 1970s. But the insides, as you can see, is kind of messed up there, were all from reprints from the 1950s. And I knew nothing about this stuff. There's an ad for Origins of Marvel Comics. But the art looked vaguely Kirby-esque, even though it wasn't. Here is an example of a creepy-looking horror story. Look, check out that face. How did that get past the Comics Code Authority? So I was interested in things like Stephen King, getting interested in old-time radio and Edgar Allan Poe. There was an episode of The Weird Circle that adapted The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. And that was my first exposure to Poe. And H.P. Lovecraft, who had been mentioned in Jim Stranko's History of Comics, Volume 1. This story was my first exposure to Joe Maneely, and this story was written by